Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Phil Mattingly. John King is off today. The White House sends its budget request over to Capitol Hill, and I'm going to break some news for you. It will not pass Congress, but it will give clues on the negotiations to come. The new CNN polling out of Iowa gives some pretty clear advice to the president. Here's what it is. Focus on your accomplishments, not your 2020 Democratic opponents. Speaking of 2020, it is time for what we like to call your daily, is Joe Biden in or out of the race?
Last week, the vice president was reportedly at 95%. I know you recently spoke with him. Is he moving closer to 100?
He is moving closer. He's someone who I am confident is going to run. I'm optimistic he's going to run.
Kind of tipped his hand a little bit. Junior senator from Delaware knows a thing or two about this. But we begin with an early spring ritual and what it actually tells us about the president. This morning, the president delivered his budget request to Congress. The asks, they're big, and they are worth about as much or as little as the dead trees they are printed on. On this, Washington agrees. The document more or less amounts to a very large paperweight. The Republican Congress largely ignored the president's last two budget requests. Democrats, now in control of the House, well, they will do the same, but with more gusto, if you will. But read the very long list of what the president wants as a campaign document, and you start to see the sketches of his 2020 message. Big border wall money, bigger money for the military, big cuts to welfare programs and agencies like the EPA. The budget's tagline, it's telling. Promises kept, taxpayers first. Read the list, and each promise pairs with a big demographic the president won in 2016 and will need to win again in 2020. Now, CNN's Caitlin Collins is with us right now at the White House. And Caitlin, I know you've memorized all the pages of this budget at this point, but tell us kind of
from
the top.
Hour.
Yeah, that's what I figured. But in the top line, what are kind of your takeaways as you look through this document right now?
Well, basically, when you're looking at this document, you're seeing what it is. Like you said, this is meaningless, especially now so that Democrats are in charge of the House. But what you're seeing is the president renew his demand that Congress pay for his border wall. In this deal, or in this proposal, he's asking for $8.6 billion for the wall. Some of it from the Department of Homeland Security, some from the Department of Defense. But Democrats are framing this as the president not learning his lesson here, coming off that shutdown fight earlier this year, that fight that did not yield any money for the president's border wall. And they say that the president has not learned his lesson. Now, the president knows that he's not going to get this money. He has lost his sway, even the sway that he had last year. But this is sending a message for 2020 and setting the president up so he can make that point to his base that he is still here and he's still fighting for the wall. Now, that comes as right now the Senate is expected to vote this week on a resolution to disapprove his declaration of a national emergency to build that wall. But the president is trying to send a message with this. You can tell he's still sensitive to those criticisms from people like Ann Coulter, who say he's not living up to his promise to build the wall because the president was lashing out at her over Twitter this weekend. You can expect the White House to try to lay out their priorities. They're actually doing something they haven't done in a while today, Phil, and that's a briefing. Sarah Sanders and the acting budget director are going to brief reporters this afternoon on the proposals that are laid out in this budget.
What a novel idea. Speak to the American public and reporters. Caitlin Collins over at the White House, thank you very much. And here with me now to share the reporting and their insights, Rachel Bade with the Washington Post, Jonathan Martin with the New York Times, CNN's Manu Raju, and Politico's Eliana Johnson. And guys, I want to start with kind of a reality check, if you will, from noted wordsmith Mike Enzi, the senator and budget chairman, who put out a statement just a short while ago that says, quote, "The president's annual budget proposal is the first step in the federal budget process and will allow us to consider how his priorities align with the priorities of Congress." That is not a ringing endorsement of the president's proposal, but it also underscores the reality, and Chairman Enzi, as somebody who's been here a while, understands how this all works, understands the reality of what this is. Manu, you're on the Hill every single day. Kind of how do Republicans take what's now being sent to Capitol Hill?
Well, look, I think that they're going to try to push for the president's funding for the wall. They realize that it's not going to get $8.6 billion for the wall. He couldn't get $1 in the last round of negotiations that led to the shutdown. This is all going to be, as this happens every time, they're going to put off the very difficult issues like the funding for the wall up until the very end, right before the end of this current fiscal year. The ultimate question is going to be whether the president digs in, whether he demands money for the wall. And a lot of that will have to do, of course, in what happens in these court challenges to the emergency declaration. If the president fails in court and does not convince the courts that he has the authority to move around money administratively, then you could see him potentially digging in and demanding this money back from Congress, and we can can have a redux of what just happened in this government shutdown. But we saw the way Pelosi's played this. She's not going to give him any money. Will she ultimately bend as we get closer to the end of the fiscal year? We'll see. But they're saying this proposal is dead on arrival because it is. That's the blueprint, and what they're proposing is not going to become law.
Why would Pelosi bend? I mean, she looked super triumphant in the first month of the Congress when she defeated Trump, didn't give him a single dollar for his wall. And you have to wonder, Republicans, they don't have an appetite for another shutdown showdown. They're they're privately probably rolling their eyes. But again, this is probably not clearly aimed at changing policy on the Hill. This is about 2020, and the president thinks the wall is something he can run on, and this is a good message for his base. And so clearly he wants to keep that out center, even though he's using the national emergency to try to do this at the same time.
Not to be the skunk at a garden party, but I've been sort of a skeptic of the coverage of the budget process long before President Trump came to office. I think that it's perhaps the most over-covered event in Washington every winter, the president's proposal, because the Congress is going to do what the Congress does. And yes, it offers some insights onto the president's priorities. Maybe that works for past presidents, but to be candid, how much is this president even engaged in this budget document? I mean, is he even aware of some of the sort of top lines for his health department or HUD? I mean, I'm skeptical. I mean, what do you think?
Well,
what do you think, Ilya?
You know, the thing that struck me in this budget was the request for wall money, which wasn't included in previous budgets at this amount. And it struck me as a concession of defeat. They wouldn't be asking for money to build the wall if they had gotten the money to build the wall and if the building of the wall was well underway. So they are spending a certain amount of money to build the wall that they've done through a national emergency declaration, but that's not enough money to complete the building of the wall, and that's evident by a request for an additional $8.6 billion. Part of that is to repay the national emergency funds, but $5 billion of that is needed for the completion of the wall, and I think at this point, because they're unlikely to get that money, it is something of a concession of defeat by the president.
Yeah, so budget nerds, it's at JMartNYT if you want to attack him for that blasphemous statement about not caring about budget. Manu, I want to go to you. So here's, I think, the concern when you talk to people on Capitol Hill, and you laid out late September, the budget fight's coming, the debt limit's coming, and we saw, Eliana makes a great point. The request for the wall money in the fiscal 19 budget was $1.6 billion, which Senate negotiators actually got for him. And then the president, in a private meeting, made clear, I didn't know that number existed, and I want $5 billion. And then
who did that?
And scalded his staff a little bit in front of a couple lawmakers. But is this setting up a clear fight that doesn't necessarily have an end game, given the stakes we're facing in September?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I don't think the president knows the end game of this. I think he needs to show to his base that he's fighting for something that he has not actually accomplished. This is the biggest legislative defeat of his time in office. He's a central piece of his campaign. He needs to show that he's doing something. How it ultimately ends, he doesn't know. The Congress doesn't know. The Democrats do know that they're not going to give him anything for this. And, you know, also one thing in his budget document, the president campaigned on eliminating the national debt. I mean, that is such an insane proposal to eliminate $20 trillion national debt and climbing. This is nothing to even get rid of the deficit, the annual deficit. He said that he would get rid of the annual deficit over the next 8 years. So it creates, a lot of aspirational goals, but probably something that he's not going to fulfill.
Yeah, balancing in 15, but essentially locking in trillion-dollar deficits. You've got your finger on the pulse of House Democrats as well as anybody right now. The budget caps come into play back in September, and not to get too wonky into it, but essentially it would mandate $126 billion in deficit reduction if nothing is done about that. What do Democrats want for a caps deal at this point?
Well, I think everybody on the Hill realistically knows those caps need to be raised and that it's going to happen. I think that, the president might be talking about his wall and might privately want to go to some sort of showdown in September when the federal budget needs to be renewed. But on Capitol Hill, again, I don't see an appetite for this. And Mitch McConnell in the Senate, he's a realist about this kind of stuff. He knows he doesn't want to do another shutdown, so these caps are going to have to be raised. The debt ceiling is going to have to be dealt with. And I think when it comes to dealing with the debt ceiling, McConnell and Pelosi are probably pretty close to at the same place. They don't want to deal with brinksmanship at the end of this year. But again, it's going to be watching the president. How hard does he push the party? And you got to feel bad for McConnell right now because you know he is not in the same place as the president is when it comes to these issues.
Yeah, and if you look up, you can pull up what the president requested on defense spending, $750 billion, and what the spending cap would actually be, which is at $576 billion. That's $174 billion apart. There's been talk that the administration would try and kind of go through another route, the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, which is kind of a cheating way to deal with the budget. But
Wouldn't be the first time.
Wouldn't be the first time. They've used it for overseas engagements a lot to try and plug some money holes. But in terms of defense spending, that's always been the hook, right? Democrats and Republicans have to get together. That's what the sequester was put in place for. What's your sense right now on how the administration wants to deal with defense spending?
You know, it's interesting. They have requested a 5% increase in defense spending. The president said he's committed to rebuilding the military. They want to cut domestic spending, and they're simply saying that the old formula of increasing every dollar that they request an increase for in defense spending, they're going to increase $1 in domestic spending. That the country cannot afford that anymore, and they're not going to abide by it. We don't see it reflected in this budget, and the administration has indicated they're simply going to push back on that.
But the Democrats will hold that defense money hostage completely. You know, they've done this before. Pelosi has done this successfully before. She'll do it again. They'll say if you want more money for the military, which is something the president wants to campaign on in 2020 and say he's strong for the military, then you got to give some domestic money too.
A strategy that was effective when Republicans controlled both chambers of Congress, and I imagine will be pretty effective now the Democrats actually control one of those chambers' comments. All right, up next, a long shot candidate for president boosts his profile, attacking the vice president in the process. Allergies of Democratic presidential candidates learning today where they could be giving an acceptance speech. Officials tell CNN the DNC has chosen to hold its 2020 Democratic convention in Milwaukee. J-Mart's breakfast recommendations are coming. For now, though, those candidates spending some time in Austin, Texas. Democratic 2020 hopefuls descending on South by Southwest this weekend, hoping to make an impression with voters. 3 of the more long-shot candidates sat down with CNN for individual town halls. South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, and former Congressman John Delaney. Here's how they're doing in the latest Monmouth poll. All 3 barely registering with voters, polling at or below 1%, both now and back in January. Now compare their numbers to the top 4 candidates in this poll, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, and Elizabeth Warren. Yeah, you see, a little bit of a differential there. All right, CNN's Jeff Zeleny joins me live from Austin. And Jeff, you've talked to just about every candidate, including these 3. What were kind of your takeaways last night as a keen observer of this 2020 process so far?
Well, Phil, I think there's no question that Mayor Buttigieg really made an introduction for himself to a national audience that he has been doing in living rooms and bars and smaller settings in Iowa and New Hampshire. And he's making the argument that, yes, he's 37 years old. He doesn't shy away from that. We have seen presidential candidates and candidates for other office trying to fudge their age or act a little older. He leans right into that. And he did so last night as well, saying, look, I have military experience, I have executive experience, and I think he also shows that he was trying to, he's strong enough to go after this administration, the president, and particularly the vice president, who also is from Indiana. But I think by and large, you mentioned the polls right there. National polls at this point, as you know, are essentially meaningless because they are a barometer of name ID only. But the Iowa poll is certainly much more interesting. But all of these new candidates trying to make their way, make their voice, introduce themselves. But Joe Biden on top of the Des Moines Register, a CNN Iowa poll on Sunday, along with Bernie Sanders. One number that was interesting to me, 60%, 6 in 10 Iowa Democrats want him to jump in. They say his experience is needed. Only 3 in 10 say it's time for someone new. So that is a challenge for these newer candidates here. We should point out everything, though. Everyone will get a full look once summer begins, and let's see who's standing by the time of the Iowa State Fair come August.
Yeah, no question about that. Jeff, hey, be careful of the scooters. I've heard that they're all over the place. I saw cars behind you. I want to make sure you don't get run over by a scooter.
They're everywhere. I know.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff Zeleny down in Austin. So scooters aside, look, it seemed like, at least for a moment, and again, we live in this kind of micro world of the Twitter sphere and all that, but there was a little bit of Mayor Pete Mentum, if you will. You had David Axelrod tweeting, quote, "I've rarely seen a candidate make better use of a televised town hall than Pete Buttigieg is on CNN tonight. Crisp, thoughtful, and relatable. He will be less of a long shot tomorrow." Mr. Jonathan Martin.
Yeah.
Is Mayor Pete less of a long shot today?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think anytime you can get that kind of national TV exposure when you aren't really that well known is a huge asset for a candidate. And look, we're in this proving ground season where in a wide open race, and you've got a couple of candidates who have big name ID or obviously on top of the polls, but this is a wide open race, and you're going to have candidates like Mayor Pete who could step up. There's going to be somebody next January, February, who we aren't talking about now, who is going to be in the mix near the front of the pack, I think, and it's just a matter of sort of who that is. And when it comes to Mayor Pete, I think it does say a lot about what the incentives are in this era. Look, a very talented politician taking a pass on statewide office to go directly from running for mayor to running for president. What's the downside of that? You get great exposure like last night. If you don't get the nomination, maybe you're on the ticket as VP, or maybe you're in the cabinet of the next Democratic president. Either way, you are showing your stuff and punching your ticket via this long national campaign for president. It really does tell us something about how people rise now in the political stratosphere.
Do you agree with that? Is that the play here? Like, just get your name out there. It's worth more than running for a lower statewide office, given the fact that with the media exposure, with social media, all that, you can just get your name out there and run.
I think that's absolutely true. And look, I think some of the candidates right now, they won't succeed in doing that. But the reason why I think that this town hall was a success for Mayor Pete was that he did impress some people like David Axelrod. That wasn't, obviously, we didn't see the same sort of reaction for the other two candidates who had them. But right now, a lot of these Democratic candidates aren't household names. And the point of going to a South by Southwest, which is mostly attended by influencers, it's not your everyday voter, is to get people paying attention to that. And I think that was a success for him. They want to try to become the sort of household name that a Joe Biden and a Bernie Sanders is right now. Those are pretty much the only two candidates in the race who are known by the average person you see walking down the street who's not tuned into politics every day. I think Mayor Pete took one step towards that. He's far from being there, but that's the reason why he had nothing to lose getting in this race, and he just gained something yesterday.
Yeah, kind of took the jab there that influencers were in Austin, and I was not.
I was not either. Don't worry.
We're all in the same place. One of the things that I was struck by last night is something that I think is kind of running roughshod through the entire Democratic Party right now, the Democratic field, and that is the idea of what are you? How do you label yourself? Take a listen to this.
So many of these labels are misused, misunderstood to the point
So how would you define
where people
yourself?
don't have any idea what they even mean anymore.
So you're not a capitalist.
Let's try to stay away from the terminology and the labels.
Bernie has to speak to what democratic socialism is.
But you are not one.
And I am not. And the centrists have to speak to whatever they are doing.
Capitalism or socialism?
Capitalism.
It's like bizarre that you actually have to pause on that question, but do the labels matter? I think people have spilled a lot of ink over this in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, Obama did something very similar. He tried not to say, well, I'm not going to label myself as a progressive, or even though he's very progressive on most issues, he didn't want to get himself in there. But it's interesting that the one thing that they're not saying is that they're not socialists. I mean, I think there's a fear among a lot of Democrats is that the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wing of the party and the Bernie Sanders wing of the party is going to eventually cast a wide net and bring them all in and force them to answer for a lot of the policies that they don't necessarily agree with. Clearly, that's the Republican strategy heading into 2020, label everyone as a socialist. These Democrats are trying to make clear that they're not. The question is that they have to differentiate themselves on some policies, because a lot of the policies they agree with are very socialist, like healthcare or Medicare for all. That's going to be the question for them going forward. But that's the one thing that I think some of those candidates may try to make clear over the weekend, that they're not socialists. Elizabeth Warren, for one, trying to make clear she's not like Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, we're already seeing Republicans on Capitol Hill do that. I mean, the NRCC is attacking House candidates, saying, from red districts, Democrats saying these guys are socialists. So in that regard, they've got to do the labels thing, because they're going to have to reject that even more forcefully. I think the other thing we saw play out specifically in Mayor Pete's interview was that, there's this question about how much you talk about Trump and the administration, how much you talk about yourself. And it'll be interesting to see if other candidates, even though, he's not going to slingshot to the front of the line anytime soon, other people might watch how he handled that. He was kind of calm. He sort of had like an He wasn't, viciously snarling when he went after the administration, but he was very pointed. I mean, talking about Vice President Mike Pence, and what was the phrase he used? Something like, is Pence a cheerleader for the porn star presidency, talking about his faith. Those are very pointed criticisms at the administration, less about his own personal experiences, but going after the administration. But the way he did that was well received, and I think it'll be interesting to see if other people try to mimic that.
Phil, very, very fast. It is striking in a period of 4 or 5 months. You've gone from the sort of Democratic frame in the midterm election, very careful, very cautious, surgically targeted at issues like health care, and now, 4 or 5 months later, they're being branded as socialist. And that does concern Democrats, especially on the Hill, especially in the House, who are trying to keep that majority that they just won last year. They're okay with some of the policies, but they fear the larger branding with the S word.
Yeah, always remember, the majority makers, they weren't the progressives. They were the moderates of the wing. All right, up next, Trump's strengths within his own party in Iowa and how it factors into his 2020 re-election campaign. To the first major 2020 campaign contest, and when it comes to how Iowa Republicans view President Trump, there are definitely some signs of strength and a few potential trouble spots for his re-election bid. The president still enjoys strong support with the state's Republicans, even though 40% say they hope he faces a challenge for the nomination. Let's take a look, dig in a little bit at what some of these numbers say. So if you look at President Trump's job approval rating, 81%, still very high and pretty much the same since it was when he was last polled in December. His actual favorability ratings in the state up to 82%. That's a 5-point increase for December. So this is obviously a positive number for the president. Look over to whether or not people want to vote for President Trump in the state. Keep in mind, this is a state the president won by more than 9 points, kind of stunning everybody back in 2016. 67% of Iowans polled here say they would, Republicans say they would definitely vote for Trump. 18% saying they would consider somebody else. 9% saying they would definitely vote for somebody else. So again, positive numbers on the top line, but still a little bit of areas of concern. One of the interesting elements of the whole poll, though, is what respondents actually want to hear from the president as he enters the 2020 campaign. Let's take a look at that. How should President Trump campaign for his re-election? 90% say focus on his accomplishments. Only 4% say attack his opponents. That might seem to differ from where the president is, but listen to this. He's done it before.
The economy is very, very strong. If you look at the stock market over the last few months, it's been great. And certainly since my election, it's up getting close to 50%. It's going very well. At the border, we're doing a great job. We're apprehending record numbers of people, 75,000 over the last short period of time. That's a lot of work, and with a wall, we wouldn't have to do it. I inherited a mess. In many ways, the Middle East, I inherited a mess, and it's straightening out a lot. We're doing very well there.
It's straightening out a lot, Phil.
Yeah, it's what he said.
It's straightening out a lot. Look, I think the biggest risk politically in what he just said is placing so many chips on the stock market. That's a volatile play, or a volatile place, I should say, and it's a volatile play or daring play by President to do that. Look, the fact is that we've seen dips in the market during his presidency, and he does not react well. Why say that in March of 2019? When in the period of now and the election, who knows what's going to happen in the market, let alone the broader economy?
Well, I have a prediction for you. I mean, this president looks for external metrics by which to gauge his success. And so, look, if the stock market dips, he'll switch to another metric and point to that. He'll look at unemployment. Yeah, well, he'll look at unemployment, or he'll look at women's jobs, or African American employment, or Hispanic employment.
Sure. Some metric.
I think it's a hill he'll manage to climb and surmount.
Yeah, when you're in the 10th year of a bull market and the market continues to look good overall and doesn't seem like a recession's coming, at least in the near term, maybe a little bit closer to election time, then that's something you'd certainly focus on. But I was struck by 40% in the poll wanted him to face a 2020 caucus challenger. But if you look at potential poll numbers of potential Trump challengers, pull those up real quick, because I think this is really interesting. The favorability, unfavorability, you can look at them there. But unsure, John Kasich, 45%, Howard Schultz, 61%, Larry Hogan, 84%, Bill Weld, 81%. And you talk about the economy or metrics, you talk about maybe the Mueller report, and a lot of these guys, as they kind of weigh whether or not they're going to consider a challenge, are waiting for some external thing to occur. To open something up.
I thought that was the fascinating part about the Iowa poll. It's significant amount. Moderates in particular, there's a split between moderates and conservatives. More moderates are interested in a challenger coming up against Trump in the Republican primary. Look, the chances of success for a primary challenger are very small given the overall enthusiasm the president has from his base and some key early primary states in particular. But if there is a challenger, that could be potentially damaging in a general election. History does not bode well for presidents who face primary challenges. We'll see if that happens. We'll see if any of these people are encouraged by those results.
Every modern president who faced a real primary challenge lost in the fall, going back to 76. So that is, in fact, the challenge that he faces is not being beaten, but being wounded by a primary challenger. And when he was right, it's the moderate wing of the party that doesn't like his conduct, doesn't like some of the policies. The problem for Weld or for Hogan, whoever does challenge him, is that a lot of their would-be voters are now called Democrats. A lot of the kind of independents or even the soft Republicans have now basically become de facto Democrats because they can't abide Trump and Trumpism. And so that's part of the challenge, is that the Democratic coalition's gotten bigger because it's absorbed some of the folks that may have voted for Bush, for example, 15 years ago.
And Rachel, the Republican Party is doing everything in their power to close the door on any type of primary challenge, acknowledging what J. Mart's laying out in terms of the history back to 1976. What triggers a run? What opens the door to somebody in your mind?
I mean, clearly everybody's watching the Mueller report right now, right? We don't know when that's coming out. Everybody says it's soon. And even when it is finalized, we're not sure when we're going to actually see those documents. So I think that's the big X factor here. What does Robert Mueller say about the president? But there's another thing here, and that is that the RNC is 100% behind the president right now. And whereas, last time there's a lot of skepticism about Trump, he sort of got a late start,
Yes.
The campaign was everywhere. The campaign is already talking about, where are they going to focus, the Midwest, Florida. They're talking about volunteers, they're raising money, and there's talk right now about campaign rallies in some of these early states. So he has sort of that infrastructure, not to mention the base and the support of the base, that's going to make it harder for anyone to step forward.
But he barely won last time, and any slippage, I think, is problematic for him. If you look at 2004 and 2012, the last two re-elections of incumbent presidents, they had unified parties, right? I mean, in 2004 and 2012, there were not sitting governors of the in-party who were openly mulling primary challenges, let alone saying that they're not going to support his re-election, right? That just didn't happen. And I think that does speak to that larger challenge he has, which is some of the folks in the party who are more moderate, center-right, who can't abide him, who, maybe that doesn't beat him in the primary, but if you don't get those folks back for the general, there's no path for him back to the presidency.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, but Rachel also makes a great point. He has an infrastructure.
Yes.
He did not have any infrastructure for the broad part of 2016.
Correct.
So they certainly have a much bigger head start.
He's an incumbent, yeah.
That's what incumbency brings you. All right, up next, could Mayor de Blasio become President de Blasio? Some of his closest aides not exactly hot on that idea.
Appreciate it very much, Tim Apple.
Tim Apple, there you go. The president today provided an explanation. It was, in fact, all about government efficiency, saying, quote, long after formally introducing Tim Cook of Apple, I quickly referred to him as Tim plus Apple, as Tim Apple, as an easy way to save time and words. Alrighty then, you can all sleep well tonight. Bill de Blasio for president. Anyone? The New York mayor is among those toying with the idea, but one report says even some of his closest allies are actually against it. Politico says a former de Blasio aide laughed out loud and called the whole notion of a run, quote, insane, with an expletive. Politico quotes de Blasio as saying lots of friends and allies also told him he was crazy to run for mayor, but he won. And Democratic Senator Doug Jones of Alabama, he's apparently not losing that much sleep over a potential rematch with Roy Moore next year. Now, Moore said on Friday he is seriously considering another run, despite the sexual misconduct accusations that derailed his campaign in the 2017 special election. Senator Jones says Republicans' reaction to Moore's resurfacing is a joke.
What's really kind of comical to me is watch the reaction of the Republicans who all supported him a couple of years ago, and now they're talking about he's a flawed candidate and yada yada yada. So I just think it's kind of comical to watch these days. But we'll be ready for whoever the nominee is next spring.
Up next, a senator on the front lines of the Me Too movement is accused of mishandling an allegation in her own office. Two people in her office. Politico broke the story this morning and says the woman making the allegation resigned in protest last summer. CNN's Athena Jones spoke with an aide to the senator this morning. And CNN, Athena, I think everybody's trying to figure out what this all means. What can you tell us about what's happening right now?
Hi, Phil. Well, this is certainly not a good headline for Senator Gillibrand, who has made a name for herself as a champion of the Me Too movement on Capitol Hill. She's spent years fighting to prevent sexual assault and harassment in the military, on college campuses, change how it's handled on Capitol Hill. So she's coming under scrutiny now because of the handling of this case. We're talking about a staffer that Politico this accuser, Politico did not name. CNN has not been able to identify her yet. We are trying to reach out to the staffer who was accused, the former staffer, Abbas Malik, who was accused of making sexually harassing remarks last summer. Now, Gillibrand's office says that they handled this just as she has called for these situations to be handled. Let me read to you a statement from the senator herself. She said, these are challenges that affect all of our nation's workplaces, including mine, and the question is whether or not they're taken seriously. As I have long said, when allegations are made in the workplace, we must believe women so that serious investigations can actually take place. We can learn the facts and there can be appropriate accountability. That's exactly what happened at every step of this case last year. I told her that we loved her at the time, and the same is true today. Of course, this staffer was not satisfied with that. But as this aide pointed out to me, look, what Senator Gillibrand and her office say, they can't avoid this sort of thing happening in any office place. Just the fact that she is a champion of the Me Too movement does not mean that she won't have people accused of harassment on her staff. They argue that they handled this case as it should have been handled, an extensive investigation. They interviewed several employees, 7 of them. They launched the investigation as soon as they were told about this accusation, and they did not find evidence of sexual harassment in this case. Phil?
Athena Jones in New York, very important story. And Rachel, I think a very explosive story, especially given the senator's role in a lot of these things. What's your read on kind of what happens next with this?
Well, I think her statement's interesting because she says in there, this process was handled correctly. We looked into this and we moved on, basically. But here's the problem. The staffer stayed in her office since this incident occurred for months. And then when Politico started asking questions about it, she dismissed that staffer. So that raises questions about, did she actually handle this the correct way? And for Gillibrand, this is an issue that she wanted to, if she runs for president, this was going to be front and center. She talks about it often ever since she came to the Senate, from military sexual assault when Brett Kavanaugh was getting confirmed, that she was one of the most vocal critics saying